Do you know God's plan for your life? And if you don't, why not? First, I would remind us that God's plan for each of us is that we be part of His kingdom. Remember, God desires that none should perish, but that all should be part of His kingdom. So God's desire for us is that we be part of His kingdom. God wants us to spend eternity with Him. There's more to God's plan for our lives than that. God plans for us to share His love with others by words and deeds. Now, how many of us wake up every morning and tell ourselves, today I'm only going to do what God wants me to do? And if you do, how long are you able to do that? You see, God has plans for us every day of our lives, but sometimes those plans require us to continue in our daily life so that God can weave His plans in with our lives. Today we're going to look at a story of Jesus and some of His disciples. And we're going to look at times when the disciples did their own plan and did not listen to Jesus or look to Jesus for His plan. And we're going to see how those various incidents turned out to help us remember we should listen to Jesus and His plan for us. John 6, starting with verse 1. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Let's stop there and recognize that John is telling this story after another story. So Jesus has finished a task, a project with His disciples. He's moving to another region. They have sailed over the Sea of Galilee. Then verse 2. Then a great multitude followed Him because they saw His signs which He performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there He sat with His disciples. So when Jesus sails across the Sea of Galilee from one multitude, how many people meet Him when He lands? Another multitude. But Jesus and His disciples, they need a little bit of a break. So Jesus takes His disciples up on the mountain and sits there with the disciples. Verse 4. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. So, what time of year is this to the Jerusalem spiritual calendar? And the answer is, it's the time of Passover. And at the time of Passover, all adults who were capable of making the journey to Jerusalem to worship this together in the city of Jerusalem were to worship Passover together in Jerusalem. So this time, many people were coming into Jerusalem. So Jesus sees crowds of people coming in for the Passover. Verse 5. Then Jesus lifted up His eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward Him, He said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" Okay. The disciples and Jesus are sitting on the mountain, on the side of the mountain, whatever. They see all of these people moving, maybe many of them moving toward Jesus and the disciples. And Jesus asked Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" I wondered why He asked Philip. I wondered if Philip was the go-to guy for planning meals, if Philip could look out over the group and say, well, there's this many, and say, well, Jesus, we need this much bread, we need this many fish, we need this many pots of water. I wondered if Philip was that guy. Let's see Philip's response, except for I lost my page. Getting too excited here. Philip's response, verse 6. But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. So Jesus asked Philip this question to get him scratching that thinking spot. How many people's out there? They're going to need to eat. They're going to want to eat. How are we going to handle this? So now Philip and likely the other disciples are thinking, feed them. They're on their way to Jerusalem. Why are we trying to mess with them? Let them go on. Let's see Philip's response. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. Did you hear what Philip was saying? Philip was saying a year's worth of pay would not feed all of them, but just a little crumb. Philip saying that's a whole lot of money to give everybody a little bit of bread. And another thing he's saying is, we ain't got that much money. What Philip might have been saying was, I ain't got that much to give. And neither does these others. So Philip is saying, I don't know how we're going to feed them. Send them somewhere else. Let's see what Jesus says. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many? So, here comes Andrew. He just heard Philip's answer. He just heard Philip say, hey, all the money we got, we can't feed these people. Let's let them move on. Andrew says, hey, I found this fella here. He's got some food. He's got his little lunchbox basket. I don't know. He says, 5 small loaves, 2 small fishes. What good is that going to do? Did you notice that both men's responses were negative? Both men's responses were no. Any way you want to look at it, both men are saying, hey, we can do this, but it ain't going to work out. Or we can try this, but it ain't going to work out. I know ain't proper English, but I think they was from the South. So here, Jesus has 2 disciples that have interacted with him to try to solve a problem. And they both said, it's not going to work. Let's continue to read verse 10. Then Jesus said, make the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. Jesus had a plan, didn't he? What was he trying to do when he was asking the disciples what they thought? Women, please listen. Please listen. Jesus was hinting to the disciples that he had a plan. Did the disciples get the hints? Nod your heads, no. Can men get hints? Nod your heads, no. Okay? Jesus here had a plan. He didn't care what these other people were thinking. Jesus knew what he was going to do. Tell them all to sit down. Now you know what Philip and Andrew were thinking. What in the world has he got on? We can't buy enough food. But Jesus tells them, Have them all sit down. Verse 11. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. Okay? Here's one of those things that I have never seen answered in a commentary, and it's my question every time to me. If the disciples were coming to Jesus and getting food and taking to the groups, when were the baskets filled? Did the disciples see the baskets running low? They go back up to Jesus, and the people see Jesus break bread again? Did the baskets never get low? Did the disciples hand out everything to this group of people here and look at the basket and it's full again? When did they realize a miracle had taken place? Was it at the very beginning when Jesus broke the bread and the fish and put it into various baskets to share? Or was it as they were traveling around handing the food out that they realized Jesus was performing a miracle? Now remember, we know at least two of these fellas said, ain't gonna work out. But what's Jesus doing? He's working it out, isn't he? Verse 12. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain so that nothing is lost. Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. Okay? So now they've handed out all the food. Everyone has eaten. Notice it says, so when they were filled. Everybody got plenty to eat. You ever gone out to eat and got plenty to eat? I ate with a friend last night, Tammy and I did. And you know, after we ate our meal, I said, you know, there's an ice cream shop a block and a half away. And he said, no. Well, Mike already had it in his plan. We had ice cream. It was Tammy and I, but we had ice cream in a thunderstorm. But it was good. Anyway, these people present had eaten till they were full. They didn't have room for ice cream. They'd had enough. So Jesus sends the apostles, the disciples around picking up the fragments, 12 baskets. Has it dawned on the apostles yet that Jesus did a miracle? Long time ago, hadn't it? Do you wonder what they were thinking about their negative responses to Jesus? They're probably thinking, I could have answered that a little better. Let's read the next verse. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, this is truly the prophet who is come into the world. So now we know more than just the disciples knew there was a miracle, don't we? Some people were paying attention. Now some just wanted to eat. So a lot of them, you know, I don't know, mama's taking care of children, daddy's taking care of children. Some was just eating as they could and taking care of family stuff. Some were paying attention to what's happening. And there were enough paying attention to what's happening that they saw Jesus there breaking 5 loaves and 2 fish into pieces to share, and everybody there had plenty to eat. They knew something was up. They realized Jesus was Messiah. So, at what point were the disciples helping Jesus and realizing, you know, if this would have been me, they'd have just all gone to the Burger King. But Jesus had a plan. At what point did it dawn on the disciples, pay attention to Jesus and his plan? Let's keep reading. Verse 15. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. So Jesus knows what the crowd is thinking, whether he'd heard things, whether the disciples told him things they were hearing, or whether God's Holy Spirit gave him the message. Jesus separated himself from the group. He has moved back up the mountain away from the crowds so that the some that wanted to make Jesus king could not. Remember, Jesus came as Messiah this time. He's coming as king in the future. Verse 16. Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over the sea toward Capernaum. And it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. Okay? So Jesus had gone to the mountain to get away from the people, to not let them install him as king, to separate himself from the group. And the disciples, remember, they came over on a boat. What did they do? They got on the boat to go back to Capernaum. Whose idea was it? Don't tell us, does it? But did you notice they forgot one key part of what was going on? Got into the boat and went over the sea toward Capernaum, and it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. So whose bright idea was it to go to Capernaum? Well, just for giggles, let's say whoever owned the boat. So don't know who it was. Don't want to blame it on anybody, but whoever owned the boat says, hey, it's dark, let's go back home. It doesn't appear as though anybody said, hey, where's Jesus? They said, let's get on the boat and go home. Let's see how it turns out. Then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. Did you hear that? The sea arose because a great wind was blowing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. Okay, so here's Jesus on the hill, away from the crowd, whether he's praying or just propped up against a tree thinking, whew, that was a long day. Or maybe he thought it was a great meal. Jesus is away from the crowd, taking it easy. The disciples decide, hey, let's go to Capernaum. Nobody asked Jesus, and what happens? A storm. They rowed the boat 3 or 4 miles. They're not getting anywhere. Storm's getting worse. And when you're hard-headed and you're on your plan, not Jesus' plan, and things aren't going right, what do? Come on, there's more than one hardhead in this room. You just keep rowing the boat, don't you? So here are the hardheads rowing the boat, trying to get to Capernaum, and Jesus knows. He knows. So he comes down off the mountain. I kind of wonder if he's shaking his head. Jesus comes down off the mountain and goes to the boat. You know, the boat that the disciples are rowing hard against the wind, against the waves. I wondered if they realized That was their plan, and they had forgot to ask Jesus what his plan was. Do you see that? It was their plan to cross the sea. Jesus wasn't even there. Let's keep reading. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." So the disciples are in the middle of a mess that was at least partly to blame on them, maybe mostly to blame on them. And this storm has come up, this mighty wind is making the sea rough, and since they're hard-headed, they keep trying and they keep trying and they keep trying, but it's not working out. Things are not getting better, and then somebody looks and says, "Hey, that looks like Jesus." I've never seen anybody walk on water. I've seen some people water skiing and scooch across the water, but not walking. So I'm wondering what the disciples thought. I'm wondering how long it took to sink into their hard heads that they had not followed Jesus' plan. They had took off on their own. Do you see that? And we know they were afraid. It tells us in verse 19, they were afraid. Then they see Jesus walking on water. They probably have never seen anybody walking on water. And, that's new to them. I would have been scared. I guess they went from afraid to scared also. Jesus tells them, "Don't be afraid, it's just me." Verse 21. Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at land where they were going. Listen to that story. Pay attention. 2 times in 2 stories, the disciples thought they had a plan. 2 times in 2 stories, they thought they had a good plan. 2 times in 2 stories, they were convinced their plan was the best plan. 2 times in 2 stories, Jesus had to remind them, God has a plan. Did you notice that? One time, they couldn't believe they could feed that many people. And one time, they couldn't believe they couldn't even get their boat to the other shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now, know that these disciples had rowed their boat or sailed their boat or both across the Sea of Galilee more times than we can begin to count. They knew when they said they were going to Capernaum that it wasn't a problem. They could easily do that. And what happens? Here comes a storm. They can't make it. Did you know that Jesus came? Did you notice Jesus came to them in the storm and said, "Do not be afraid." You see, how many storms do we bring into our lives by heading to Capernaum because we think it's time? How many? See, Jesus has a plan for each of us. Every one of us, God has a plan for our lives. Now, yes, He means for us to have a job, raise our family, provide well for our family, rear our children in godly fashion, have a nice house for the family to grow up in, have plenty of groceries for the family to eat and be healthy. But that's not the only plan God has for you and for me. God has plans for each of us that He weaves into our lives as we travel this earth. Now, it's easy for us to look at our lives and think, well, I'm not that good at speaking or whatever, and say God would not have me to share of His love with others by words. There are other ways. You recognize that, don't you? There are other ways. Every one of us needs to pay attention to God's will in our lives. And yes, and trust me, men are not the only people who can't take hints. God places before each of us opportunities to help others. And each of us can help them or move on. How often do we move on? How often have we went past that person that we knew we could help? How often has there been a person there that we knew we could help, but we were headed to Walmart, so we just went on? You see, God places these opportunities before us to see our response. Just like He tested Philip, He tests us. Did Philip pass the test that day? He got a good refresher course though, didn't he? We fail the test often. God keeps giving us chances. Now, let me say this before we quit today. If you do not know God's will for your life, please let me know. Please. Okay? There are people here that can help you find God's will for your life. If you don't know how to help others in God's name, we can help you find out how. We can help you find a place. We can help you find that you enjoy doing. That with God, you can teach others about God. Because that's what God has called us to. It's more than He just wants us in heaven forever. Because He don't want us hard heads in heaven. He wants us doing His will in heaven. And we've got to learn how to do His will here in this world. Please, if you need help discerning, let me know. We can pray together. We can study together. God will show you what He has planned for you. And we together can work in God's kingdom.